Lionheart. Motion Pictures.
John Wick 4 marked the end of a saga that redefined action cinema in the last decade. Directed by Chad Stahelski, the film pushes John Wick do his physical and emotional limits on a journey through Osaka, Berlin, Paris, and Nova York in his quest for freedom against the vegetable. More than just a sequence of surgically choreographed chases and shots. The film of a reflection on destiny, honor, loyalty, and the price of redemption. His script analysis and the narrative, visual, and thematic elements that transformed the film into a global phenomenon, discussing each awards win cinematography. Character desenvolvement, the symbolism of the sacred Stargaze and the legacy de Francine Leaves for the contemporary action genre.
When John Wick Chapter 4 arrived in theaters, it did not simply continue a franchise. It closed a circle that had been drawing itself tighter and tighter since 2014. What began as a modest revenge thriller about a retired hitman avenging the death of a puppy he had 10 years and for films later, evolved into one of the most ambitious action mythologies in modern cinema. Chapter 4 is not just the biggest film in the series in terms of scale, running time, and body count. It is also the most philosophically loaded, the most visually audacious, and arguably the most emotionally resonant chapter of the entire saga. To understand why this film became a global talking point, generating endless breakdowns, reaction videos, and debates across social media, we need to look at it from several angles at once. Its narrative structure, its themes of fate and freedom, its character work, its stunt choreography, its cinematography, its music, and finally, the way it chooses to end a story that many assumed could only end in one way. The plot, on its surface, is simple. John Wick has spent 3 films accumulating enemies within the High Table, the shadowy organization that governs the criminal underworld through a strict code of rules, debts, and consequences. By the start of Chapter 4, he has become excommunicado, stripped of the protections the Continental hotels once offered him, and hunted by every assassin on the planet who wants the enormous bounty on his head. He discovers, through his old ally the Bowery King, that there may be a way out of this endless cycle of violence, a formal duel against a representative of the High Table, an old-world method of settling disputes of honor that, if won, would grant him his freedom once and for all. But standing between Wick and that duel is the Marquis Vincent de Gramont, a High Table elder sent to clean up the mess Wick has caused. A man who is willing to burn down every relationship Wick has ever built, turning old friends into enemies and old enemies into unlikely allies, in order to make an example of him. That description, however, barely scratches the surface of what the film is actually doing. The genius of the John Wick series has always been its world building. The way it treats the criminal underworld as a kind of parallel civilization with its own laws, its own currency of gold coins, its own diplomatic protocols, and its own rigid, almost feudal hierarchy. Chapter 4 pushes this world building further than ever before, introducing new institutions like the Osaka Continental, run by Wick's old friend Shimazu and his daughter Akira, and expanding the mythology of the High Table into something closer to European aristocracy crossed with a criminal syndicate crossed with a religious order. This is a world where debts are sacred, where hospitality is inviolable, where a marker, a blood oath, can compel a person to do almost anything, and where honor, however twisted and violent its expression may be, still means something. It is this insistence on rules within chaos that gives the John Wick universe its strange moral gravity. Violence in this world is never random. It is ritualized, coded, almost liturgical, and Chapter 4 leans into that ritualism harder than any film before it. At the emotional center of all of this is John Wick himself, played once again by Keanu Reeves in a performance that has become something like a modern myth in its own right. By this point in the saga, Wick barely speaks. Reeves communicates almost everything through physicality, the exhausted slump of his shoulders between fights, the way he absorbs punishment with an almost supernatural stoicism, the flicker of something like grief or resignation that crosses his face in quieter moments. Chapter 4 is deeply interested in exhaustion. This is not a hero who fights because he enjoys it, or because he is invincible. He fights because the world keeps forcing him to, and the film makes sure we feel the cumulative weight of that. Every bruise, every broken bone implied by the sound design, every labored breath after a set piece, builds a portrait of a man who is not so much fighting his enemies anymore as he is fighting the very structure of the world he lives in. That is the thematic core of the whole film. John Wick's real enemy was never really any single villain. It is the system itself, the high table, the endless cycle of debts and violence that treats human lives as currency. This is why the film's engagement with themes of fate and destiny matters so much. Throughout Chapter 4, there are repeated references to tarot cards, to death as an inevitability, to the idea that Wick's path has already been written and that all he can do is choose how he walks it. The Bowery King, in one of his key scenes, essentially frames Wick's entire situation as a kind of existential wager everyone dies. The only real freedom is in how you face that fact. This is a surprisingly rich thematic thread for an action franchise to carry, and it elevates Chapter 4 beyond simple spectacle. The film is, in its own strange way, meditating on mortality, on the human need for meaning within suffering, and on whether a person who has caused so much death can ever truly earn peace. When the story eventually arrives at its most famous set piece, the dual structure that closes the film, this thematic groundwork pays off. The final confrontation is not just a fight, it is staged and shot like a ritual, almost sacred in its formality. Because the entire film has been building toward the idea that Wick's story can only end through a kind of sacrifice. One of the most fascinating additions to this chapter is Kane, played by Donnie Yen, a blind assassin who is pulled out of retirement and forced by the Marquis to hunt down his old friend John Wick, under threat to his own daughter's safety. Kane is, in many ways, a mirror of Wick himself, another retired killer who tried to leave the life behind for the sake of family. Another man bound by the high table's merciless system of debts and threats. The blindness is not just a gimmick for impressive choreography, though it certainly delivers that, it is also a thematic device. Kane cannot see the world the way others do, and yet he navigates violence with an almost eerie precision, guided by sound, memory, and instinct. There is something poetic in the way his disability becomes a metaphor for the entire underworld the film depicts. A world where people move through darkness, guided by codes and rules rather than clear sight. Where morality itself has become something you have to feel your way through rather than something you can see clearly. The relationship between Wick and Kane. To men forced by circumstance to become enemies despite genuine mutual respect. Gives the film some of its most emotionally layered scenes, culminating in a fight between them that is as much about reluctant camaraderie as it is about violence. Standing above all of this manipulation is the Marquis de Gramont, played by Bill Skarsgård, who brings a very different energy to the role of antagonist than previous high-table villains in the series. Where earlier antagonists like Vigio Tarasov or Santino D'Antonio were driven by personal vendettas or ambition, the Marquis is something colder, an aristocrat, a bureaucrat of violence, a man who treats human lives, including the lives of his own subordinates, as expendable tools in service of an institution he has fully internalized. His disdain for Wick is almost philosophical. He sees Wick's continued survival as an affront to the natural order of the high table, a stain that must be erased not out of hatred, but out of a kind of aristocratic disgust. Skarsgård plays him with a controlled, theatrical menace. Someone who seems almost bored by the violence he orchestrates, which makes him deeply unsettling. He represents the film's critique of institutional power, unlike the street-level killers and assassins who at least operate under a code of honor. The Marquis represents power without accountability, someone who can rewrite the rules whenever it is convenient for him, and who is ultimately undone by his own arrogance when he assumes those same rules will always protect him. The film also brings back Ian McShane's Winston, the manager of the New York Continental, whose loyalty to Wick has always been complicated by his loyalty to the institution he runs. Chapter 4 forces Winston into his most difficult position yet, as the Marquis strips him of his hotel and his authority, and Winston is forced to make a choice between self-preservation and standing by the man he has, in his own guarded way, always respected. This relationship has always been one of the emotional backbones of the series, precisely because it is never simple. Winston is not a hero in the traditional sense. He is a survivor, a diplomat, someone who has made peace with the moral compromises required to keep his small corner of the underworld functioning. Watching him finally choose Wick's side, even knowing the cost, gives the film one of its most satisfying character arcs, and sets up one of its most controversial and debated final scenes. Alongside these figures, the film introduces a delightful new element, in the form of Mr. Nobody, played by Shamia Anderson, a mysterious tracker who moves through the story alongside his loyal Belgian Malinois dog, hunting the bounty on Wick's head while never quite committing to being either ally or enemy. This character injects a welcome note of dry humor and unpredictability into a film that otherwise carries a very heavy tone. His dog, trained to disarm and incapacitate with brutal efficiency, becomes one of the most memorable action elements of the film, and the character's ambiguous morality, always calculating the odds, always keeping his options open, reflects the film's broader interest in characters who exist in the grey spaces between the rigid black and white of the high table's rules. Now, when it comes to actually analysing why this film became such a massive cultural event, we have to talk about the action choreography, because this is where Chapter 4 truly distinguishes itself, not just within its own franchise, but within the entire landscape of modern action cinema. Director Chad Stahelski, himself a former stuntman, has always approached the John Wick films with an obsessive attention to the craft of fight choreography, favouring long unbroken takes, wide shots that let the audience see the full geography of a fight, and a commitment to practical stunt work over excessive digital effects. Chapter 4 takes this philosophy to its logical extreme, delivering set pieces of a scale and complexity rarely seen in modern blockbusters. The film's opening act takes us to Osaka, where Wick seeks refuge at the Continental run by his old friend Shimezu, played by Hiroyuki Sanada, alongside his daughter Akira, played by Rina Sawayama. The sequence that follows, as the Marquis's forces including Kane assault the hotel, is a masterclass in tension and spatial choreography, blending traditional weaponry, nunchaku, and gunplay with a color palette of deep blues and golden light that gives the entire sequence a painterly, almost dreamlike quality. What makes this sequence so effective is not just the technical skill of the fight choreography, but the emotional stakes underneath it. The betrayal of hospitality, the death of a man who has been Wick's friend for decades, and the way the fight forces both Wick and Kane to confront exactly what kind of world they are trapped in. From there, the film moves to Berlin, where Wick seeks help from the Bowery King and encounters Killer Harkin, a nightclub owner and assassin, in a sequence that trades the elegance of Osaka for a grittier, more industrial aesthetic, all strobing lights and pounding music, before eventually giving way to one of the film's most technically dazzling sequences, an aerial, top-down shot of Wick fighting his way through a building, and homage to overhead action sequences seen in games and other action films before it, but executed here with a fluidity and clarity that turns what could have been a gimmick into one of the most purely enjoyable action sequences of the decade. It is playful, almost like watching a video game unfold in real time, and it demonstrates the film's willingness to experiment with form, even within its already established action vocabulary. But it is Paris where Chapter 4 truly reaches for greatness, and where its most iconic sequences take place. The film stages an extended chase and gunfight around the Arc de Triomphe, using the chaos of Parisian traffic as both obstacle and weapon. Wick, badly wounded and stripped of easy resources, must navigate a roundabout filled with speeding cars while being hunted by dozens of assassins, all while trying to simply survive long enough to make it to the church where his duel will take place. The sequence is a marvel of practical stunt coordination, real cars, real collisions, real physical performers absorbing genuine impacts, choreographed with a rhythm that somehow finds moments of dark comedy within the carnage, as Wick uses traffic patterns almost as a dance partner, timing his movements against oncoming vehicles with an almost musical precision. It is a sequence that rewards repeated viewing because there is always another layer of detail, another small piece of environmental storytelling, another perfectly timed stunt that you might have missed the first time. And then there is the staircase. If there is one image from Chapter 4 that has embedded itself most deeply into the cultural conversation around the film, it is the sequence at the steps of Seika, See you, where Wick, exhausted and bleeding, must fight his way up and down an enormous flight of stairs against wave after wave of assassins, only to be repeatedly knocked back down to the bottom, forced to climb again. The symbolism here is not subtle, and it does not need to be. This is a direct visual echo of the myth of Sisyphus, the man condemned to eternally push a boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down every time he nears the top. It is the film's clearest visual statement of its central theme, that Wick's entire existence has become a cycle of struggle without resolution, that every victory he wins is temporary, that the system he is fighting against is designed to exhaust him into submission rather than defeat him outright. The sequence is grueling to watch, deliberately so. The sound design emphasizes every impact, every fall down the stone steps, every labored breath. And by the time Wick finally reaches the top, the audience feels the exhaustion right alongside him. It is one of the most purely cinematic expressions of theme through action choreography that the genre has ever produced. A sequence where the physical mechanics of the fight and the emotional and philosophical meaning of the story are completely fused together. This brings us to the film's climax, the formal duel between John Wick and the Marquis's chosen champion. Staged in the classical tradition of pistol duels at dawn, complete with the ritualistic pacing, counting steps, and turning to fire, the choice to end the film's massive, maximalist action spectacle with something so stripped down and formal is a bold structural decision. And it works precisely because of everything that has come before it. After hours of overwhelming, chaotic violence, the duel's simplicity feels almost like a release, a return to the honor-bound rules that the underworld of this franchise claims to operate by, even as the story has spent its entire runtime demonstrating how easily those rules can be corrupted by men like the Marquis. There are clear echoes here of classic Western cinema, the lone gunslinger walking into a final confrontation not for glory but for the simple, desperate hope of finally being left alone. The film's use of silence in this sequence, after so much sound and fury, is one of its smartest choices, letting the tension of the moment breathe rather than rushing towards spectacle. Visually, the film owes an enormous debt to cinematographer Don Lawson, whose work across the John Wick series has always treated the criminal underworld as a kind of neon-lit, gothic cathedral, all deep shadows punctuated by saturated pools of color, blues and reds and golds that give every location its own distinct visual identity. Chapter 4 pushes this even further, with sequences shot in genuinely stunning locations. Real palaces, real historic streets, real architectural landmarks, that give the film a sense of scale and grandeur that elevates it above the visual language of a typical action film. The decision to shoot so much of the action in wide shots, favoring clarity over the rapid-cut chaos common in modern blockbuster fight scenes, is not just an aesthetic choice, it is a philosophical one, rooted in the belief that the audience should be able to see and appreciate the skill and physicality of the performers, that the geography of a fight should always be legible, that action should be choreographed like dance rather than assembled like a collage of disconnected impacts in an editing room. The score, composed by Tyler Bates and Joel J. Richard, complements this visual approach with a sound that blends propulsive electronic elements with more classical, almost operatic, orchestration during the film's most emotionally weighted moments. The music never overwhelms the action. Instead, it underscores the rhythm of the choreography, building tension during quieter stalking sequences and exploding into intensity during the film's biggest set pieces, while also finding space for more melancholic, reflective cues during the film's quieter emotional beats, particularly in its final act. Of course, no honest critical analysis of Chapter 4 can ignore the conversations around its runtime. At nearly 2 hours and 45 minutes, it is by far the longest film in the franchise, and this length has been a genuine point of debate among both critics and audiences. There is a valid argument that the film's midsection, particularly some of the earlier stretches before Paris, could have been tightened, that certain sequences, while individually impressive, contribute to a sense of narrative bloat when strung together. But there is also a strong counter-argument, one that I find persuasive, that the film's length is actually essential to its thematic goals. A film about exhaustion, about the grinding, repetitive weight of endless struggle, arguably needs the audience to feel some of that exhaustion themselves in order for its themes to land with full force. The staircase sequence would not hit nearly as hard if it arrived after a brisk 90-minute film. Its power comes precisely from how tired both Wick and the audience already are by the time we reach it. This does not mean every minute of the runtime is perfectly justified. But it does mean the length is not simply self-indulgent. It is, at least in part, a deliberate formal choice in service of the story's meaning. The film's cultural impact upon release was immediate and enormous. Social media exploded with clips of the staircase sequence, the Arc de Triomphe chase, and the top-down Berlin fight, each one accumulating millions of views as viewers dissected the choreography frame by frame, debating which sequence was the best in the franchise's history, comparing the film's stunt work favorably against other major action releases of the year. Keanu Reeves' status as a beloved cultural figure, already cemented through years of viral moments, and a widely admired public persona, only added fuel to the film's popularity, with many viewers framing their support for the film as, in part, an expression of affection for Reeves himself, for his famously grueling commitment to performing his own stunts, for the visible dedication he brings to the physical craft of the role. This is worth noting as a critical point, because it speaks to something the John Wick franchise has always understood intuitively, that action cinema is not just about spectacle, it is about trust between the audience and the performer. The sense that what you are watching is real skill, real risk, real physical achievement, rather than a digital approximation assembled after the fact. That authenticity is part of why the fanbase discusses these films with the kind of reverence, usually reserved for martial arts classics or golden age Hollywood stunt work. Now we arrive at the film's ending, and this is where Chapter 4 makes its most divisive and, I would argue, most narratively courageous choice. After winning his duel, badly wounded, John Wick makes his way to the steps of a church, where he collapses beside Winston and in his final moments seems to find something like peace, gazing up at the sky before succumbing to his wounds. He dies. The character who has anchored for films of relentless violence, who has survived seemingly impossible odds time and again does not walk away from his final battle. He is buried, and the film's closing images show his grave beside that of his late wife Helen, with a headstone reading simply that he was a loving husband. It is a genuinely bold ending for a franchise of this size and commercial success. One that resists the easy temptation to simply set up another sequel with Wick riding off into the sunset, still armed, still ready for the next threat. Instead, the film insists on closure, on the idea that the only true freedom available to a man like John Wick, a man who has caused and suffered so much violence, was always going to be death, but a death chosen on his own terms, in service of protecting the people he loves, rather than one imposed on him by the endless machinery of the high table. There is, of course, ambiguity deliberately built into this ending. A small visual beat involving a flickering candle that has led to endless fan theories about whether Wick truly died or whether some possibility remains open, and the franchise's own subsequent expansion, including the film Ballerina, which exists within this same timeline and features a cameo appearance tied to these events, has only added fuel to that speculation. But regardless of where future films in this universe choose to take the mythology, the emotional and thematic truth of Chapter 4's ending remains intact. This was a story about a man trying to earn his freedom. And freedom, in the moral logic the film has constructed across for movies, could only ever be purchased at the highest possible price. That is a genuinely rare thing for a mainstream action blockbuster to commit to. And it is a large part of why Chapter 4 has been so widely praised not just as spectacle, but as a satisfying and coherent conclusion to a genuine cinematic saga. It is also worth reflecting on how the film handles its supporting web of relationships in service of this ending. The betrayal and eventual redemption arc of Winston, the tragic, almost Shakespearean fate of Cain, forced by circumstance into conflict with a man he respects, the quiet dignity of Shimozu's sacrifice in Osaka. All of these threads reinforce the film's larger argument about the corrosive effects of the high table system on human relationships. Nearly every major character in the film is, at some point, forced to choose between personal loyalty and institutional obligation. And the film consistently frames institutional obligation as the corrupting force, the thing that turns friends into enemies, that treats human bonds as leverage rather than something sacred, insists Lightwick's final act of free rather than live in servitude to that system, becomes not just a personal resolution but a thematic statement about the value of human connection over institutional power. From a broader industry perspective, Chapter 4's success also represents something important about the current state of action cinema. In an era where so many major blockbusters lean heavily on digital effects, where action sequences are often assembled through rapid editing designed to obscure rather than showcase the physical performance of the actors involved, the John Wick franchise has consistently stood as a counter-argument, proof that audiences still deeply respond to craftsmanship, to visible skill, to the kind of choreography that rewards close attention rather than passive consumption. Chad Stahelski's background as a stunt coordinator, and his insistence on maintaining that sensibility even as the franchise's budgets and ambitions have grown, has helped keep the series feeling distinct within a crowded genre landscape. Chapter 4, as the culmination of this approach, essentially serves as a statement of purpose for an entire philosophy of action filmmaking, one built on clarity, physicality, and formal rigor rather than sheer scale for its own sake. It is also worth acknowledging the film's limitations honestly, in the spirit of genuine, critical analysis rather than pure celebration. Some of the film's dialogue remains functional at best, existing primarily to move the plot between action sequences rather than to deliver memorable characterization through language alone, though this has arguably always been true of the franchise, which has always communicated its themes primarily through action and visual storytelling rather than through dialogue. Certain new characters, while visually striking, are given relatively thin development given the film's already massive runtime, something that becomes more noticeable on repeat viewings once the initial spectacle has worn off slightly. And the film's insistence on escalating stakes, more assassins, bigger set pieces, higher body counts, does occasionally risk numbing the audience to violence that, in earlier films, felt more consistently weighted with consequence. These are not fatal flaws, but they are worth naming honestly, because a truly critical analysis should resist the temptation to treat any film, however impressive, as beyond reasonable critique. Even with those caveats, though, it is hard to argue against the overall achievement of Chapter 4 as both a piece of pure action filmmaking craft and as a satisfying, thematically coherent conclusion to a story that could easily have overstayed its welcome after 4 increasingly bloated installments. Instead, the film manages to feel like the natural, inevitable culmination of everything the series had been building towards since its very first scene. A dog, a car, a grieving man with nothing left to lose. By the time we reach the final shot of Wick's grave, the film has completed a genuine character arc, transforming a story that began as a simple, brutal revenge tale into something closer to tragedy in the classical sense. A man destroyed not by his enemies, but by his own inability to escape the violent world he once chose to enter, finally finding release only through the ultimate sacrifice. It is worth spending more time with the film's supporting performances, because so much of what makes the John Wick universe feel lived in comes from actors who bring history and gravity to roles that, on paper, could easily have felt like functional genre archetypes. Lawrence Fishburne returns as the Bowery King, a character who exists somewhere between prophet and warlord, ruling over an underground network of homeless informants and messengers with a mixture of theatrical grandeur and genuine world-weariness. Fishburne plays him less as a villain or ally and more as a kind of oracle, someone who has learned to survive within the high table system by understanding its rules better than almost anyone else. And his scenes with Wick carry the weight of two old survivors comparing notes on how much longer they can keep playing a game that was never designed to let anyone win outright. There is also a quiet, but deeply felt tribute embedded within the film's fabric. A dedication to the late Lance Reddick, whose performance as Karen, the unfailingly composed concierge of the New York Continental, had become one of the emotional anchors of the franchise across its earlier installments. Reddick's passing shortly after the film's completion added an unplanned layer of poignancy to Karen's scenes in Chapter 4, transforming what were already dignified, understated moments into something closer to an elegy. A reminder that even within a franchise built on stylized violence, the human relationships underpinning it were never treated as disposable. The film's approach to sound design deserves its own dedicated attention, because so much of what makes the action in Chapter 4 land with such visceral force comes not from the visuals alone, but from an extraordinarily detailed sonic landscape. Every gunshot in the film has been mixed with a distinct, almost tactile weight. Every reload, every shell casing hitting the floor, every grunt of exertion or pained exhale, is rendered with a clarity that pulls the audience deeper into the physical reality of each fight. This attention to sound becomes especially important during Zeka, where the absence of dialogue forces the film to communicate Wick's exhaustion almost entirely through breathing. Through the dull thud of bodies hitting stone steps, through the metallic clatter of weapons dropped and retrieved. It is a sequence that would lose much of its power if the sound design were less meticulous. Because it is precisely this sonic texture that makes the audience feel the cumulative physical toll on Wick's body in a way that visuals alone could not fully achieve. Symbolism runs quietly but persistently throughout Chapter 4, often expressed through recurring visual motifs rather than explicit dialogue. Coins, the currency of the high table's underworld economy, appear throughout the film as a symbol of transactional loyalty, a reminder that in this world, Even friendship and hospitality have been reduced to units of exchange. Candles appear repeatedly as well, associated with debts, oaths, and the marking of formal agreements, and their flickering presence in the film's final moments has become a focal point of audience speculation precisely because the film has spent its entire runtime establishing candles as symbols of binding obligation and unfinished business. Dogs, too, carry symbolic weight far beyond their narrative function as loyal companions, tracing back to the very first film's inciting incident. Mr. Nobody's Belgian Malinois in Chapter 4 continues this thread, representing a kind of uncorrupted loyalty that stands in stark contrast to the constantly shifting transactional alliances among the human characters, a reminder of the simpler, purer forms of loyalty that Wick has spent the entire series trying, and largely failing, to reclaim in his own human relationships. Placing Chapter 4 in conversation with its predecessors also reveals how deliberately the franchise has evolved across its runtime. The original John Wick was a lean, almost minimalist revenge thriller, contained largely within New York City, driven by a simple emotional hook and a tightly controlled scope. Chapter 2 expanded the mythology internationally, introducing Rome and deepening the high table's bureaucratic complexity, while Chapter 3 Best Parabellum pushed the action into increasingly stylized and exotic territory, including its now famous sequences involving trained attack dogs and a horseback chase through Manhattan traffic. Chapter 4 represents the culmination of this steady expansion, taking the globe-trotting scale of the previous films and combining it with a narrative ambition that finally engages directly with the question the series had been circling since its inception: can a man like John Wick ever actually escape the world he has built for himself, or was he always destined to be consumed by it? Watching the franchise as a whole, Chapter 4 retroactively clarifies the thematic through-line of the entire saga, transforming what might have looked like an increasingly excessive action franchise into something closer to a unified four-part tragedy about the impossibility of true retirement from a life defined by violence. This tragic structure is worth examining more closely, because Chapter 4 borrows quite deliberately from classical dramatic tradition. Like the protagonists of Greek tragedy, John Wick is defined by a fatal flaw that is inseparable from his greatest strength: his absolute, unwavering commitment to a personal code of honor and loyalty. It is this same commitment that made him a legendary assassin in his youth, that drove his devastating rampage of vengeance in the first film, and that ultimately compels him, in Chapter 4, to accept an all but suicidal formal duel rather than simply continuing to run and hide. The film understands that Wick's insistence on doing things properly, on respecting debts, on honoring the old rules even as the men around him abandon them for convenience, is both his defining virtue and the very trait that guarantees his story can only end in sacrifice. This is precisely the kind of internal contradiction that classical tragedy is built upon, and it is a large part of why Chapter 4's ending feels earned rather than simply grim for the sake of shock value. The theme of found family, present throughout the franchise in smaller doses, also reaches a kind of quiet culmination in Chapter 4. Wick's relationships with Winston, with the Bowery King, with Karen, with his dog, have always functioned as substitutes for the biological family he lost. First his wife Helen, and by extension, the ordinary domestic life he briefly tried to build with her. The film's final act, in which Winston stands by Wick's side despite every incentive to abandon him, and in which Wick's last thoughts seem to drift toward Helen rather than toward vengeance or survival, reinforces the idea that everything Wick has done across 4 films has ultimately been in service of reclaiming, however briefly and however tragically, some version of that lost domestic peace. His death beside her grave is not simply a sad ending. Within the film's own internal logic, it functions as a reunion, the closing of a loop that began with her death in the very first film. This circularity gives Chapter 4 a structural elegance that elevates it above a simple continuation of episodic action plots, transforming the franchise as a whole into something closer to a single, extended story about grief, love, and the terrible cost of trying to outrun both. It is also worth situating Chapter 4 within the broader landscape of international action cinema, because part of what makes its choreography so celebrated is the way it openly synthesizes influences from multiple traditions. The formal, ritualized dueling culture referenced in the film's climax draws on classical Western genre conventions, while the hand-to-hand combat sequences throughout the film borrow heavily from Hong Kong action cinema's tradition of long, unbroken takes that showcase the full physical skill of performers. An approach reinforced by the casting of Donnie Yen, one of the most respected martial artists in the genre's history. The gunfights, meanwhile, owe an obvious debt to Hong Kong heroic bloodshed cinema of the 80s and 90s. with their balletic blending of gunplay and physical combat. By weaving these traditions together within a single coherent visual language, rather than simply borrowing surface-level aesthetics, Chapter 4 positions itself as a kind of global synthesis of action filmmaking history, which is part of why it has resonated so strongly with audiences and critics who are deeply versed in the genre's international lineage. Costume and production design also deserve mention, though they are often overshadowed in discussions of the film by its action sequences. The tailored suits that define Wick's silhouette throughout the franchise take on an almost armor-like quality in Chapter 4. A visual reminder that his professional identity has become inseparable from his physical body. A second skin he can never fully remove, even when he tries to leave that life behind. The High Table's aristocratic wardrobe, full of high collars, structured coats, and old-world formality, reinforces the film's framing of institutional power as something closer to inherited nobility than modern criminal enterprise. A visual argument that reinforces the thematic contrast between the Marquis's cold, inherited authority and the earned, blood-bought loyalty of characters like Winston and the Bowery King. Finally, it is worth reflecting on how Chapter 4 handles pacing at a structural level. Even setting aside the runtime debate discussed earlier, the film is built almost like a relay race, passing Wick from location to location, ally to ally, each stop stripping away another layer of his resources, his allies, and his physical resilience, until he arrives at the steps of Seika, Seer with nothing left but sheer will. This structure mirrors the classical hero's journey in reverse, rather than accumulating power and allies as the story progresses. Wick is steadily divested of everything until only his core identity remains. It is a demanding structure for a nearly 3-hour film to sustain. But it is also precisely why the ending feels so cathartic rather than exhausting on a purely narrative level. Because by the time Wick finally wins his freedom, the audience has watched every possible support system stripped away, leaving a victory that feels genuinely hard-won rather than simply delivered by narrative convenience. In the years since its release, John Wick Chapter 4 has continued to be discussed as a high point not just for the franchise, but for the action genre as a whole in the 21st century, frequently cited alongside films from other national cinema traditions renowned for their action choreography as evidence that Hollywood blockbuster filmmaking can still produce genuinely world-class physical performance and camera work when craftsmanship is prioritized over shortcuts. Its influence can already be seen in the way other productions have begun emphasizing longer takes, clearer geography, and more visible stunt work in their own marketing and critical conversations, suggesting that Chapter 4's success has helped shift, at least somewhat, the broader industry's approach to how action is filmed and sold to audiences. There is also something worth saying about how Chapter 4 handles the idea of consequence within its action sequences, a quality that distinguishes it from many other blockbusters operating at a similar scale. In a great deal of modern action cinema, gunfire and combat exist in a kind of consequence-free space, where the hero can absorb an almost limitless number of hits without any lasting visual or physical toll, and where the sheer volume of violence on screen becomes numbing precisely because it carries no weight. Chapter 4 works hard to resist this tendency, even as it escalates its own body count to franchise highs. Wick's tactical vest, visibly absorbing impact after impact throughout a given sequence, becomes a kind of visual scoreboard, letting the audience track just how much punishment he has taken in real time. By the time he removes it partway through the film, exposing him to genuine danger for the first time, the audience already understands, on a gut level, just how much protection he has lost. This is a small but telling example of how the film uses its own internal logic and continuity to keep escalating stakes feeling earned rather than arbitrary, even across a nearly 3-hour runtime packed with combat. The film's handling of geography and space is another aspect that deserves deeper appreciation, because so much of what separates truly great action choreography from merely competent action choreography comes down to spatial clarity. Throughout Chapter 4, the camera consistently orients the audience within the physical space of a given set piece before allowing chaos to unfold. We understand where the exits are, where cover exists, how many enemies remain, and where our protagonist stands relative to all of it. This spatial clarity is what allows sequences like the Berlin nightclub fight or the overhead Berlin building assault to feel legible even at their most frenetic, because the film has done the patient work of establishing the rules of each environment before testing them. This philosophy extends to smaller, quieter choices as well, such as the way certain fights are staged to make full use of a location's specific architecture. Gun stores, art galleries, hotel lobbies, each environment shaping the choreography that takes place within it. rather than simply serving as a generic backdrop, interchangeable with any other. This site-specific approach to fight design is part of what gives the John Wick franchise its distinctive identity within the broader action genre, and Chapter 4 represents its most fully realized expression yet. It is also useful to consider Chapter 4 alongside the broader critical conversation about franchise fatigue in contemporary cinema. By the time this fourth installment arrived, audiences had grown increasingly skeptical of long-running franchises that seemed content to simply repeat successful formulas without meaningful evolution, churning out sequels that added scale without adding substance. Chapter 4 stands as something of a rebuttal to that trend, precisely because it uses its scale in service of narrative and thematic escalation rather than as a substitute for it. Every new location, every new character, every larger set piece exists to deepen the film's exploration of its central themes rather than simply to top the spectacle of the previous installment for its own sake. This is a difficult balance for any franchise to strike, particularly one built around such a specific, potentially repetitive premise. A lone gunman fighting his way through wave after wave of enemies. And the fact that Chapter 4 manages to make that premise feel newly urgent and meaningful after 3 previous films is a significant achievement in itself. The film's reception among martial arts and action choreography communities specifically has also been notable, with many professional stunt performers and choreographers publicly praising the technical achievement of sequences like the staircase fight and the overhead building assault, citing the sheer logistical complexity of coordinating so many performers across such demanding physical sequences while maintaining visual clarity and narrative coherence throughout. This kind of respect from within the industry itself speaks to something beyond simple audience enthusiasm, suggesting that Chapter 4 represents a genuine technical landmark in the craft of action filmmaking, not merely a commercially successful spectacle. There is also a case to be made that Chapter 4 succeeds in part because of how it balances its most maximalist impulses with moments of genuine stillness and quiet. For all its relentless action, the film consistently makes room for scenes of conversation, of characters simply sitting across from one another discussing the impossible situation they find themselves in, weighing loyalty against survival, honor against pragmatism. These quieter scenes, often shot with the same careful visual composition as the action sequences, give the film's spectacle room to breathe, and they are essential to making the eventual emotional payoff of the ending land as powerfully as it does. Without these moments of quiet character work, threaded carefully throughout the film's massive runtime, the final act's emotional weight would feel unearned. A spectacle of sacrifice, without the necessary groundwork of relationship and meaning behind it. Finally, it is worth considering what Chapter 4 suggests about the future possibilities of the action genre as a whole. Its success demonstrates that audiences remain hungry for action cinema built on visible craftsmanship, patient choreography, and genuine physical risk, even in an era increasingly dominated by digitally assisted spectacle. It suggests that thematic, ambition, and formal discipline are not obstacles to commercial success within the action genre, but can in fact be significant contributors to it. That audiences are capable of engaging deeply with meditations on fate, mortality, and institutional power when those themes are delivered through the universal, cross-cultural language of expertly crafted physical performance. In this sense, Chapter 4's legacy may extend well beyond its own franchise, offering a template for how blockbuster action filmmaking can aspire to genuine artistic ambition without sacrificing the visceral pleasures that make the genre so enduringly popular in the first place. Editing philosophy is another element worth isolating for close attention, because in an industry where rapid cutting has become the default language of action filmmaking, Chapter 4's editorial restraint is almost a political statement in its own right. Editor Nathan Orloff, working closely with Stahelski's choreographer-first approach, allows takes to run far longer than convention typically permits, trusting the performers, the camera operators, and the fight choreography itself to generate tension rather than relying on the rhythm of the cut to manufacture excitement artificially. This approach demands an enormous amount of rehearsal and precision from everyone involved, since mistakes cannot simply be hidden by cutting away at the right moment. But the payoff is a viewing experience that feels grounded and tactile in a way that faster, more fragmented editing styles rarely achieve. Audiences may not always consciously register why a given sequence feels more visceral or more satisfying than a comparable sequence in another blockbuster. But the editorial patience on display in Chapter 4 is very often the invisible reason why. The downfall of the Marquis de Gramont also rewards closer examination. because it reflects the film's broader thesis about the fragility of power built on institutional authority rather than earned respect. Throughout the film, the Marquis operates from a position of near total control, commanding resources, personnel, and the full backing of the high table's hierarchy. Yet his plan unravels precisely because he consistently underestimates the informal networks of loyalty and honor that exist outside his direct control. The debts owed by Winston, the personal history shared between Wick and Kane, the quiet defiance of concierge and hotel staff, who continue operating according to the old code even as the Marquis attempts to rewrite the rules to suit his own convenience. His eventual defeat is not simply a matter of losing a duel, it is the film's demonstration that institutions built purely on top-down authority, without any genuine reciprocal loyalty, are ultimately more fragile than they appear, vulnerable to exactly the kind of stubborn, code-bound resistance that Wick represents throughout the story. In this sense, the Marquis functions less as a personal nemesis for Wick and more as a symbolic representation of unaccountable institutional power generally. And his defeat carries a satisfying thematic resonance well beyond the immediate plot mechanics of the story. There is also a strong argument to be made for reading Chapter through a lens closer to opera than traditional action cinema. Given how consciously the film embraces heightened, theatrical emotion, ritualized confrontation, and grand, almost operatic scale in its staging. The formal duel that closes the film, complete with codified rules, witnesses, and ceremonial procedure, plays out with the same deliberate, almost musical pacing one might find in the climactic aria of a tragic opera, building tension through repetition and ritual rather than surprise. Even the film's use of music throughout its biggest set pieces leans into this operatic sensibility, treating action sequences less as pure adrenaline delivery systems and more as elaborately staged performances with their own internal rhythm and crescendo. This operatic quality is part of what gives Chapter its distinctive emotional register, allowing it to sit comfortably alongside its more grounded, brutal violence without ever feeling tonally inconsistent. Because the film has fully committed to treating its underworld mythology with the same gravity and formal seriousness that opera traditionally reserves for stories of doomed love, betrayal, and honor. Returning once more to the film's ending, it is worth considering how thoroughly it reframes the meaning of victory within the story's internal logic. In a conventional action film, victory would mean Wick surviving his final confrontation and walking away, free to continue his story in future installments. Chapter instead redefines victory as the achievement of freedom itself, regardless of whether that freedom comes paired with survival. This distinction matters enormously to the film's thematic coherence. Throughout the story, Wick has never been fighting simply to stay alive. Survival alone was never the goal. Since a life spent perpetually running and hiding from the high table would hardly qualify as living in any meaningful sense. What he has been fighting for across for films is the right to determine the terms of his own existence, to escape a system that treats him as property to be hunted, bought, and sold according to rules he never agreed to. Winning the duel, defeating the Marquis, and dying on his own terms, beside the grave of the woman he loved, having finally settled every debt and honored every code he swore himself to, represents the only version of victory the film's own moral universe would allow to feel genuine rather than hollow. A version of the ending where Wick simply walked away unscathed would have, paradoxically, felt like a betrayal of everything the story had established about the true cost of the life he chose to lead. This is ultimately what separates Chapter 4 from being merely a highly accomplished piece of action entertainment and elevates it into something closer to a complete artistic statement. The film understands that spectacle without meaning eventually becomes empty. That audiences, even those drawn primarily by the promise of expertly choreographed violence, respond most powerfully when that violence is placed in service of genuine emotional and thematic stakes. By committing fully to its themes of fate, sacrifice, and the corrosive nature of institutional power, and by following those themes through to their most difficult, uncomfortable but ultimately truthful conclusion. Chapter 4 achieves a rare synthesis of populist entertainment and genuine narrative ambition, offering audiences both the visceral thrill of masterfully crafted action and the deeper satisfaction of a story that respects its own internal logic enough to see it through to its most honest possible ending. It is also worth acknowledging how the film treats its secondary assassins and mercenaries, the countless nameless opponents Wick faces across every set piece, because even here the film resists total dehumanization. Many of these encounters include small, wordless character beats, a nod of professional respect before combat begins, a moment of hesitation, a flicker of fear. that remind the audience these are not simply disposable obstacles but people operating within the same brutal economic system that has shaped Wick's own life. This does not excuse the violence the film revels in, but it does add a layer of moral texture that many lesser action films skip entirely, treating anonymous henchmen as pure spectacle fodder without any acknowledgement of the human cost. Embedded in every single confrontation, Chapter 4 never lets the audience forget that this world runs on desperation as much as it runs on skill, that many of the people Wick fights are themselves trapped within the same predatory hierarchy he has spent the entire saga trying to escape. Taken together, all of these elements, the choreography, the cinematography, the sound design, the performances, the symbolism, the thematic ambition, and the genuinely daring ending, combine to explain why John Wick Chapter 4 became such an enormous global conversation upon release, and why that conversation has continued long after its theatrical run ended. It is a film that rewards patient, close viewing as much as it rewards pure sensory enjoyment. A rare combination in modern blockbuster filmmaking, and it stands as a strong candidate for the finest achievement in a franchise that has consistently pushed the boundaries of what action cinema can accomplish both technically and emotionally. Ultimately, what makes John Wick Chapter 4 such a rich film to analyze is the way it manages to function simultaneously on multiple levels. As pure, exhilarating spectacle, delivering some of the most impressive action choreography ever put to film, and as a genuinely thoughtful meditation on fate, freedom, honor, and the human cost of violence. It is a film that trusts its audience to sit with exhaustion, to appreciate the craft of a long unbroken take, to find meaning in a staircase climbed over and over again, and to accept an ending that offers closure through sacrifice rather than the easy comfort of a hero who survives unscathed. Few franchises manage to grow more ambitious and more emotionally resonant with each installment, and fewer still manage to end on such a high note. John Wick Chapter 4 stands as proof that action cinema, when made with genuine care and formal discipline, can achieve something close to art. And that is precisely why audiences around the world responded to it not just with excitement, but with something closer to reverence.